Recroom, the highly popular social VR platform with millions of users, has officially come to an end. But how did this happen? And what caused its downfall? Let's dive right into it. And to start it off at the beginning, we have to go all the way back to 2016. Because this is when Recroom got first announced to the world with a simple Reddit post and a small beta test on Steam. But while the graphics back then definitely weren't anything to write home about, the game was still gaining some popularity, even though there weren't many people with a PC VR headset at the time. And this increase became even more significant once the developers started to add a new paintball mode and their Adventure Quest series to it. But the creators behind Rec Room didn't stop there, because they kept adding in new features that were being requested by the players nearly every week. And this included things like private rooms to a lounge, and also many quality of life improvements that other social VR platforms were missing at the time. But it would still take them until mid 2017 when they finally announced their so-called Maker Pen. And this became quite a big deal, because this tool would allow users to start creating their own objects and rooms from the ground up. Although, when this got released, it still only had very basic features. And with this, it was also the start of the transition from Rec Room being a normal curated game that only had worlds made by its official team to an actual user-generated platform. However, the devs luckily did continue to create some popular high-quality experiences over the years to follow. But getting back to 2017, in this same year, we also saw the official launch on PlayStation VR, which would mark the first time that Rec Room became available outside of the PC VR market. And they quickly doubled down on this, because in 2018, they unlocked the so-called screen mode feature, which made it possible for people to play Rec Room on their PC, even without owning a VR headset at all. And that, of course, caused another big influx of new players, which made their newly released first-party experience, which was a Battle Royale world known as Rec Royale, even more popular. But then, the devs released one of the biggest updates that would change the future of Rec Room altogether. Because in the following year of 2019, we finally got an upgrade to the creation tools that now actually let you create fully functional rooms that you can share with friends. And to get this into the hands of even more players, the team behind it also released Rec Room for both iOS devices and the brand new Quest headsets. However, sadly not all content and experiences of the PC version were directly available on the Quest. And instead, it would actually take multiple months before the first party worlds finally arrived. But on the other hand, this was also the year that the purchase of Rec tokens got introduced. And while slightly controversial at launch, this became the main currency to buy your skins and cosmetics in-game with real-life money. And of course, the main reason behind it was so that the game itself could create some revenue besides just the one-time big fundings that they were often getting. So, in search of other ways to increase their funds, they introduced something completely new, known as Rec Room Plus. And as you might have guessed by its name, this is your typical monthly plan that would give you a bunch of these previously mentioned tokens on a regular basis. But as a bonus, it would also give you early access to new features and other perks that normal players wouldn't have. Now, while this initially did come with some critique, eventually it got accepted quite well by most players, since the game itself was still completely free to play at the end of the day. Oh, and not to forget, is that 2020 was also the year that they released it for Xbox and introduced a bunch of upgrades and customizations to their avatars. But this is also where things get really interesting, because next to the inevitable release on Android devices that came in 2021, the player base in general started to see an exponential growth thanks to a certain little problem that was going on worldwide. Since, as you might imagine, this global shutdown caused even more people to find ways to connect and play with their friends online. And thanks to VR and Rec Room being pretty much the perfect way to do this, the amount of players just skyrocketed until its peak in 2022. However, while at this point it seemed like Rec Room was unstoppable, thanks to the increasing demand, they started hiring a lot of extra staff. And next to that, they also released some interesting programs that could let creators earn some actual real-life cash by making and selling their own tools inside of virtual reality. However, sadly at the end of this year, things started to look a lot less optimistic than they were initially thinking, since not only was the hype slowly fading out with the world going back to normal, the team also made some drastic changes in their user interface that was received overall quite badly by most users. And that same can be said for their new AI features that caused much more backlash than they were originally expecting. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, even though new features and content were still being added at a much higher pace than most other VR games, the amount of actual good improvements were significantly less than before. But the biggest problem that started the entire downfall of Rec Room was just around the corner. However, before we get into that, let's first have a quick word from the company that made this video possible. Because none other than Cat VR, who are known for creating VR treadmills that look like they come straight out of Ready Player One, are once again taking virtual reality to the next level. Because while we are normally limited by the boundary system inside our VR experiences, it is Cat VR that has created these VR treadmills that let you run and jump without any limitation. And since their most recent version, which is known as the C2 Plus Enhanced, is compatible with every VR headset that you can think of, it is also often considered as the dream upgrade for any VR user. And they even go so far that it has things like haptic feedback built into it, as well as a vehicle hub, which will make it feel even more realistic when you're racing on a track or flying through the sky. And as a cherry on top, you can also use the code VRelity for a whopping $130 off on your entire purchase. So for those who are interested, I'll leave a link in the description below. But that gets us to the downfall of Recroom, which really started in 2024 after what seemed to be a big update and implementation of their so-called full body avatars. And in theory, this feature was supposed to give people full arms and legs instead of just being a flying torso. But as you can imagine, this caused some massive controversy since Recroom characters always looked the same for the past decade, besides the obvious graphics improvements. So many original players weren't happy with this update at all. And with the online player base sinking slowly each and every day, the real bad news started to come out in mid-2025, because this is when Recroom Inclusive announced a major internal restructuring that ended up laying off nearly half of their development team. And while at that time they mentioned that they were doing this so that they could pivot towards long-term sustainability, this wouldn't be the case in the end at all. Because not long after, we got the official announcement that Recroom will be fully shut down on June 1st, 2026. Now, do keep in mind that they have had over 150 million users in total, with a company valuation of a whopping 3.5 billion at its peak. So when they said in their official statement that the closer choice was because that despite its popularity, they never quite figured out how to make Recroom a sustainably profitable business. But this is kind of surprising, because unlike most free-to-play games that fail in the long term, they did have hundreds of millions of funding, as well as multiple in-game ways to generate revenue. Think about the previously mentioned tokens, or even Recroom Plus. But no matter the reason behind it, the decision was final. And yes, while it is worth mentioning that the company Snap did acquire some of Recroom's assets, and even hire a couple of its staff, they did put out a report saying that neither company has signaled that Recroom will live in any capacity at Snap in the future. So in conclusion, that means that it has now truly come to its end. But that is not all, because besides just Recroom, Meta's own social VR platform, known as Horizon Worlds, has also been shut down and might completely change the future of virtual reality. So click on the video that you see on screen right now to make sure you don't miss out on that. And of course, stay awesome.